teaching Jane Austen in the classroom. Would you please welcome Ben Taaffe?
Thank you to the Jane Austen Society for the opportunity to speak to you. It is indeed an honour to see you all here and to speak to you. Jane Austen in the classroom. Yes, as you just heard, the single setting of my working life was at Ascombe School at Edgecliff, 43 years. The school runs by the Dalton Plan. In a sentence, Ascombe halves the number of lessons which are conventional school teachers. It adds to the timetable a series of what are called studies. These are classes, timetabled by the girls themselves, which take place in a teacher's own classroom, a study. Students come to a study to work on their weekly assignments, to describe to a teacher how they're going. So I spent my working life of those 43 years in small-scale conversations with interested students. Ascombe does not choose its students on academic ability. Every cohort brings with it a wide range of skills. I learned how to teach by having to teach literature and writing skills to weak students and to students of average ability. I learned too, ladies and gentlemen, how many students, not just the Ascamic ones, bring to literature a very particular bias. It's good you're sitting down to receive this. I learned from my students that writers do not have any plan when they write. Writers do not say what they mean. Literature carries hidden meanings. Writers are mischievous people who conceal their meanings and their strategies. Nothing is clear. Everything is opaque. Literature is a cryptic crossword, like the Heralds on Friday. With some students, the bias fades. They grow up, they reflect, they think for themselves. The textual evidence is so consistent and so pervasive that they concede its existence and even its force. But it is still with this bias lingering in their minds the students come to Jane Austen. What are the best times to begin? The best year, I think, as late in year 10 as possible, when most students are 16. The best first text, Pride and Prejudice. What I have to say now comes largely from my experience of teaching 3 novels to years 10, 11 and 12. Pride and Prejudice, Emma and Persuasion. That was my first point, my prologue. Point 2. With the bias fading, what do students find? Jane Austen, I hear, is refreshing. There is the engaging force of the literal world of Pride and Prejudice. Nothing here appears hidden. Jane Austen says what she means. Students follow the plot. They understand the characters and character conflict. They enjoy the satiric portrait of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and in Emma, the wonderful portrait of Mrs. Elton. I've heard several times, Jane Austen makes me laugh out loud, Mr. Taaffe. The students are certainly drawn into some of the novel's propositions about marriage. It's in these propositions that they first truly engage with Jane Austen. Here's a familiar scene from Pride and Prejudice. Elizabeth has forcibly declined the marriage proposal of Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins turns to Charlotte Lucas. The Bennets were engaged to dine with the Lucases, and again, during the chief of the day, was Miss Lucas so kind as to listen to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth took an opportunity of thanking her. "It keeps him in good humour," said she, "and I'm more obliged to you than I can express." Charlotte assured her friend of her satisfaction in being useful, and that it amply repaid her for the sacrifice of her time. This was very amiable, but Charlotte's kindness extended farther than Elizabeth had any conception of. Its object was nothing less than to secure her from any return of Mr. Collins' addresses by engaging them towards herself. Such was Miss Lucas's scheme, and appearances were so favourable that when they parted at night, she would have felt almost sure of success if he had not been to have to leave Hertfordshire so very soon. But here she did an injustice to the fire and independence of his character. For it led him to escape out of Longbourn House the next morning with admirable slyness, and hasten to Lucas Lodge to throw himself at her feet. He was anxious to avoid the notice of his cousins, from a conviction that if they saw him depart, they could not fail to conjecture his design, and he was not willing to have the event known till its success could be known likewise. For though feeling almost secure, and with reason, for Charlotte had been tolerably encouraging, he was comparatively diffident since the adventure of Wednesday. His reception, however, was of the most flattering kind. Miss Lucas perceived him from an upper window as he walked towards the house, and instantly set out to meet him accidentally in the lane. But little had she dared to hope that so much love and eloquence awaited her there. Students write the marriage off. They express pity for Charlotte, and also puzzlement. How could Charlotte accept Mr. Collins' proposal? They cast themselves as Elizabeth. Then I ask, is this to be a successful marriage? I'm measuring success against the expectations of the partners. Charlotte needs security from want. Her parents will not be able to provide for her. She has told Elizabeth, I'm not romantic, you know. I never was. Just a few sentences on, we learn that Mr. Collins' prospects of future wealth were exceedingly fair. The girl's judgment? Charlotte's is the miserable marriage, set against Jane and Mr. Bingley, against Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, the two couples who in the girl's eyes exhibit an unambiguous marital felicity. It is indeed a matter of judgment, a matter of opinion, but there is a case to be put. The most successful marriage of Pride and Prejudice is that of Charlotte and Mr. Collins. The marriage meets perfectly the expectations of its partners. There is no uncertainty. There is the security of immediate acceptance. The girls used to leave such a lesson very cross with me, and at the same time, a little disturbed. They would concede, grudgingly, that it is not possible to write off Charlotte and Mr. Collins. Jane Austen doesn't. They figure prominently in subsequent chapters when Elizabeth goes to visit. It's one of the first occasions in the lives of the girls that a novel has caused them truly to pause and to think, to recognise that their own preconceptions, here those of marital happiness, can come under powerful challenge. It is certainly correct, as I heard from the seniors, that Jane Austen sets couples in marked juxtaposition. There is, and I did point this out to them, ladies and gentlemen, their tacit concession that Jane Austen has planned her work. We explore the other couples. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, the Gardiners, Jane and Mr. Bingley, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy, Lydia and Wickham. Not all unions are happy ones, and the process of securing a happy engagement may be fraught. It may involve misunderstandings and allow only tentative and uncertain progress. But the novel's resolution is satisfying. The students like to hear two sets of Jane Austen's final words about Elizabeth and Darcy. These words mark a realistic endorsement of the couple. On the evening of their engagement, Elizabeth and Darcy are, in Jane Austen's own words, the unacknowledged lovers. The hallway has separated them from the moment they enter the house. For the evening, again in Jane Austen's words, Elizabeth is agitated and confused. And now this from Jane Austen. Elizabeth rather knew that she was happy than felt herself to be so. Listen again. Elizabeth rather knew that she was happy than felt herself to be so. What Elizabeth knows is distinct from how she feels at the moment. Happiness is not an emotion. Happiness is an awareness, a knowledge. Happiness is bred in the mind. That went down very well with the singers. Pride and Prejudice concludes with the memory of the role of the Gardiners in effecting the meeting of Elizabeth and Darcy. That role was, the novel's final words, the means of uniting them. We meet that resolution again in Jane Austen. What's the final word of Emma? Union. Point 3. The literal focus remains secure. The question now is, how do a novel's literal references carry a figurative force? That's to say that the literal scenes represent a series of ideas. Jane Austen does truly probe the characters and the action. The girls best understood the figurative force by way of senior extension courses. It used to be possible to have read and studied Pride and Prejudice in Year 10, Persuasion in Year 11, then Emma, and possibly Mansfield Park in Year 12. That afforded a very comprehensive study of Jane Austen. In the New South Wales Senior English curriculum today, all that has changed. Only Emma appears and is an optional advanced text in Year 12. I now do private tutoring in the eastern suburbs. In 10 years, I have yet to meet a school which is studying Emma. If extension is the word, we effect that extension by the act of superimposition. Place the literal elements of one novel onto those of another, then look at the patterns which emerge. The process discloses a great deal. Each text refocuses the other texts. Pride and Prejudice acts as a foundation stone on which you can build Mansfield Park, Emma, and Persuasion. Point 4. A first extension. A Jane Austen heroine undertakes a journey from home to visit a significant other place. Elizabeth Bennet accompanies her aunt and uncle on a tour which leads her to Pemberley, the home of Mr. Darcy. Emma Woodhouse goes to Donwell Abbey, the home of Mr. Knightley. Fanny Price leaves Mansfield Park and returns to her first home in Portsmouth. It's a journey whose literal description carries a powerful figurative force. I'll look in some detail at Elizabeth Bennet's journey, which takes her to Pemberley. At this stage of the plot, Elizabeth has strongly declined Mr. Darcy's proposal of marriage. Here's Elizabeth's first perception of Pemberley, of Mr. Darcy's house. Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the first appearance of Pemberley Woods with some perturbation, and when at length they turned in at the lodge, her spirits were in a high flutter. The park was very large and contained great variety of ground. They entered it in one of its lowest points and drove for some time through a beautiful wood stretching over a wide extent. Elizabeth's mind was too full for conversation, but she saw and admired every remarkable spot and point of view. They gradually ascended for half a mile and then found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence where the wood ceased, and the eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of the valley, into which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome, stone building, standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high, woody hills, and in front a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and that moment she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. Elizabeth and the gardeners had followed the housekeeper and Mrs. Reynolds into the dining parlour. It was a large, well-proportioned room, handsomely fitted up. Elizabeth, after slightly surveying it, went to a window to enjoy its prospect. The hill, crowned with wood, from which they had descended, receiving increasing abruptness from the distance, was a beautiful object. Every disposition of the ground was good, and she looked on the whole scene, the river, the trees scattered on its banks, and the winding of the valley as far as she could trace it, with delight. As they passed into other rooms, these objects were taking different positions, but from every window there were beauties to be seen. The rooms were lofty and handsome, and their furniture suitable to the fortune of their proprietor. But Elizabeth saw, with admiration of his taste, that it was neither gaudy nor uselessly fine, with less of splendour and more real elegance than the furniture of Rosings. Mrs. Reynolds' respect for Elizabeth seemed to increase on this intimation of knowing her master. "Does that young lady know Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth coloured and said, "A little." "And do you not think him a very handsome gentleman, ma'am?" "Yes, very handsome. From the house to the man. What and whom Elizabeth sees are consistently handsome." Elizabeth has begun knowing Mr. Darcy by assuming that a first meeting allowed her to know everything. He doesn't score well there. She can now concede that she knows Mr. Darcy only a little. She recognises that her prior judgment was truly fallible. Recognising her prior fault is a key element in her learning. A small step, but progress. Downstairs in Pemberley, Elizabeth sees a miniature of Mr. Darcy. Only by going upstairs does she see a full portrait. In the gallery there were many family portraits, but they could have little to fix the attention of a stranger. Elizabeth walked on in quest of the only face whose features would be known to her. At last it arrested her, and she beheld a striking resemblance to Mr. Darcy, with such a smile over the face as she remembered to have sometimes seen when he looked at her. Elizabeth's discovery of Mr. Darcy appears in terms of windows and portraits. She has various points of view. She sees the whole ground of the estate. She goes from knowing little to going upstairs to the gallery, where she is arrested by the larger, fuller version of the man. Only in the light of these discoveries does Jane Austen bring in Mr. Darcy himself. They were within 20 yards of each other, and so abrupt was his appearance that it was impossible to avoid his sight. Their eyes instantly met, and the cheeks of each were overspread with the deepest blush. He absolutely started and for a moment seemed immovable from surprise, but shortly recovering himself, advanced towards the party and spoke to Elizabeth, if not in terms of perfect composure, at least of perfect civility. The sudden appearance of Mr. Darcy in person marks a challenge to both himself and Elizabeth. But her prior discoveries stand. Elizabeth has seen Pemberley. She has seen and begun to know Mr. Darcy from Pemberley's point of view. A literal journey to Pemberley and a figurative journey, a journey of the mind. Emma Woodhouse makes a similar discovery when she visits Donwell Abbey, the home of Mr. Knightley. It was so long since Emma had been at the Abbey that as soon as she was satisfied of her father's comfort, she was glad to leave him and look around her, eager to refresh and correct her memory with more particular observation, more exact understanding of a house and grounds which must ever be so interesting to her and all her family. She felt all the honest pride and complacency which her alliance with the present and future proprietor could fairly warrant, as she viewed the respectable size and style of the building, its suitable, becoming, characteristic situation, low and sheltered, its ample garden stretching down to meadows, washed by a stream of which the Abbey, with all the old neglected prospect, had scarcely a sight, and its abundance of timber in rows and avenues which neither fashion nor extravagance had rooted up. The house was larger than Hartfield and totally unlike it, covering a good deal of ground, rambling and irregular, with many comfortable and one or two handsome rooms. It was just what it ought to be, and it looked what it was. It was just what it ought to be, and it looked what it was, and Emma felt an increasing respect for it, as the residence of a family of such true gentility, untainted in blood and understanding. In discovering the home of Mr. Knightley, Emma discovers much of the qualities of the man. She sees, she understands. Fanny Price leaves Portsmouth for Mansfield Park. She returns to Portsmouth, where a key discovery awaits. Portsmouth was Portsmouth. Mansfield was home. These are journeys to places which are already, or which will be, the heroine's home. There's a growing understanding of this in Elizabeth and Emma. Fanny is already certain. Each heroine's literal journey is also, as I've called it, a figurative journey, a journey of the mind. The seniors enjoyed this. I have to add one other detail of the Aschamites, one which they share with the tutoring students of the moment. Almost all my tutoring students, and most of my seniors to whom I taught Jane Austen, are very good at maths. Most of them studied high-level maths. They are deductive thinkers. I came to learn this. To say that the journeys of the heroines constitute a journey of the mind is akin to teaching them a key mathematics formula. A maths formula marks a pattern, one which is steady and altogether consistent. The pattern in the journey is clear and forceful when students first meet it. It assumes a greater force when they juxtapose Elizabeth, Emma, and Fanny. The journey of the heroine takes students a long way from their useful bias. It marks the moment when they first look on Jane Austen with awe. Both the heroine and the young readers are on a journey. The journey and the discovery appeal to the seniors' sense of their own experience. They always enjoyed, every class, the image of the windows. I used to walk over to some of the windows in my classroom. I'd look at the world from this angle and that, until the class I was offering them an example of the 19th century experience. I encouraged them in studies to go to the windows and to become Elizabeth. They did. They truly paid attention to what a frame of reference allowed them to see. Journeys, windows, just as precise as maths. I once had a routine note from an Ascham mother. Her daughter was in my Year 12 English class and my Year 12 roll call group. She'd been absent the previous day. The mother asked that her daughter be excused and added a final sentence. I'm enjoying living with Jane Austen. Point 5. A second extension. What is the role of the rogue, the villain, the 18th century Picaro in Jane Austen? Here from Pride and Prejudice is the arrival of Mr. Wickham. The Bennet sisters have walked into Meryton. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with an officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny, concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air. All wondered who he could be. And Kitty and Lydia, determined if possible to find out, led the way across the street under pretence of wanting something in an opposite shop, and fortunately had just gained the pavement when the two gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Mr. Denny introduced them directly, and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and he was happy to say had accepted a commission in their corps. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favour. He had all the best part of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and very pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy readiness of conversation. A readiness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming, and the whole party was still standing and talking together very agreeably, when the sound of horses drew their notice, and Darcy and Bingley were seen riding down the street. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the two gentlemen came directly towards them and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and Miss Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn, on purpose to inquire after her. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was beginning to determine not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth, when they were suddenly arrested by the sight of a stranger. And Elizabeth, happening to see the countenance of both of them as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed colour. One looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat. the salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible not to long to know. How deftly Jane Austen employs perspective. We see the arrival of Mr. Wickham in terms of Elizabeth's perception. She sees that the colour of each man's face changes markedly. One looked white, the other red. We can infer, plausibly, that it is Mr. Darcy white with anger, Mr. Wickham red from embarrassment. But strictly speaking, we cannot know. We're like Elizabeth, who cannot know the reason of this silent but meaningful exchange. Mr. Wickham engages Elizabeth's attention. As he does so, he sows confusion. It will be some time before Elizabeth can truly know the character of the man to whom she has felt this immediate attraction. Now to Emma. Here's the arrival of Frank Churchill. The morning of the interesting day arrived, and Mrs. Weston's faithful pupil, that's Emma herself, did not forget either at 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock that she was to think of her at 4. "My dear, dear, anxious friend," said she in mental soliloquy while walking downstairs from her own room. "The clock struck 12 as she passed through the hall. 'Tis 12, I shall not forget to forgive you 4 hours hence, and by this time tomorrow perhaps, or a little later, I may be thinking of the possibility of their all calling here. I'm sure they will bring him soon." She opened the parlour door and saw 2 gentlemen sitting with her father, Mr. Weston and his son. They'd been arrived only a few minutes, and Mr. Weston had scarcely finished his explanation of Frank's being a day before his time, and her father was yet in the midst of his very civil welcome and congratulations, when she appeared to have her share of surprise, introduction, and pleasure. From the very moment of Frank's introduction, Jane Austen leaves us to clues. The image of the clock is important. Frank Churchill will not be organised by time. He is from the first a challenge to authority, near to the authority of time. Frank lacks a sense of time. The novel will illustrate how he also lacks a moral sense, how he is, like Mr. Wickham, an anarchic figure. The rogues constitute quite a cast. Mr. Wickham, Frank Churchill, from Mansfield Park, Henry Crawford and his sister Mary Crawford, from Persuasion, William Walter Elliot. Each comes from outside the world of a small society into which she or he steps. None of them, as I used to say in class, has a postcode. Each of them takes on the appearance of the small society and is confused in the eyes of the heroine with the hero. It is in the rogues that Jane Austen illustrates the fragility of that society with which she deals. Each rogue causes a profound disturbance. Mr. Wickham prompts Lydia to elope. Frank Churchill prompts Emma's carelessness and then her rudeness to Miss Bates. It takes time and effort by that disturbed society to reconstitute itself. It can do so only by expelling the rogue. Structure in society and obedience to its rules are a comfort and are necessary. None of those rogues I named has any further place in Highbury, Meryton, or Mansfield Park. Only with the rogue's expulsion may the novels move to the wedding of the resolution. The wedding, a key emblem of social order. My very best lesson on the road took place outside the classroom. I was a pupil. One of my students was my teacher. For all my years at Ascombe, I organised theatre excursions. To the Nimrod of the 1970s and 80s, to the Sydney Theatre Company, to the Nimrod of the 1970s and 1980s, to the opera, to the ballet. I always had a steady stream of students from all years keen to see a play. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1982, we went to Joan Sutherland. Mozart premiered Don Giovanni in 1787. Jane Austen was 12. There we were in what is now the Joan Sutherland Theatre, at the interval of a splendid performance of Don Giovanni. Geoffrey Black was singing the Don. My student, my teacher, happened to have a seat next to me. And like me, she preferred to stay in the theatre during an interval. Mr. Taaffe, I know who Don Giovanni is. What do you mean, Melissa? He's Mr. Wickham. She was right. Mozart's Road, Jane Austen's Road. Both of them figures from the 18th century, the Picaro of the picaresque novel. Listen now, ladies and gentlemen, to the words of Mozart's finale. Don Giovanni has been expelled. Hell awaits him, and he's taken down to the flames. The 6 remaining characters, 2 couples, a lonely woman, a servant, urge all of us to listen as they repeat what they call an ancient song. This is the end of those who hurt, and death of the perfidious life is always the same. This is the end of those who hurt, and death of the perfidious life is always the same. Point 6, a third and final extension, indoor and outdoor scenes. This was the topic which every class, whether advanced English or extension, found the most absorbing. We'd studied in detail the proposals which the heroines received, in particular Elizabeth from Mr. Collins and Mr. Darcy, Emma from Mr. Knightley, Mr. Elton and Mr. Knightley. But I often began this topic with a moment we've already seen and heard here today. Listen again to the proposal which Charlotte Lucas receives from Mr. Collins. Charlotte did injustice to the fire and independence of Mr. Collins' character, for it led him to escape out of Longbourn House, and next morning with admirable slyness and hasten to Lucas Lodge and throw himself at her feet. His reception was of the most flattering kind. Miss Lucas perceived him from an upper window as he walked towards the house and instantly set out to meet him accidentally in the lane. But little had she dared to hope that so much love and eloquence awaited her there. Jane Austen buries the place setting. It's only in a simple adverbial phrase, in the lane. The place setting is not the subject of the sentence, but the place is there. Mr. Collins' proposal may seem diminished by its setting. It's only in a lane, but it is a successful proposal. Like the other successful proposals of the novels, Mr. Collins' proposal takes place outdoors. Indoors is the necessary setting for failed proposals. In the where of the proposals, there lies Jane Austen's remarkable sense of the significance of place. Think about Elizabeth Bennet's progress with proposals. Mr. Collins' proposal to Elizabeth, a failure. Mr. Darcy's first proposal to Elizabeth, a failure. Both are indoor scenes. Mr. Darcy's letter to Elizabeth describing the character of Mr. Wickham. It's a first step in the long journey which brings Elizabeth and Darcy together. He delivers it in an outdoor scene, in the lane next to the park. Yes, another lane. Elizabeth's experience mirrors that of Charlotte Lucas. From the gallery at Pemberley, Elizabeth looks out of the window. We learn that in her eyes, as you heard, every disposition of the ground was good, and she looked on the whole scene with delight. Yes, she's seeing the whole man in the whole scene. In addition, she's looking at a place out of doors. Mr. Darcy's unexpected return to Pemberley moments later. It may embarrass both Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy that their meeting is an outdoor scene. Elizabeth receives the letter from Jane about Lydia's elopement with Wickham, a profound failure not just of a proposal but of a marriage, an indoor scene. Lady Catherine de Bourgh visits Longbourn. She's determined to end any talk of her nephew's marriage to Elizabeth. She insists on speaking to Elizabeth alone in what she calls a prettyish kind of a little wilderness. There is an irony, of course. Despite her determination to prevent the marriage to Mr. Darcy, Lady Catherine chooses to issue her imperative to Elizabeth in an outdoor scene. Mr. Darcy's second successful proposal, an outdoor scene, and a walk. Think of Emma Woodhouse. Mr. Elton proposes to Emma in the carriage on the way home from Randall's. The proposal certainly fails. It's an indoor scene in the carriage. Emma's enclosed and cannot escape. Mr. Knightley's proposal, this proposal succeeds. It's an outdoor scene. When the weather has cleared and on a walk, out of doors, and a journey, another journey of the mind. The place settings, inside and out, carry a figurative force. The indoors world of rooms, of houses, of a carriage at night is crushing. It imprisons. It separates. It may prevent departure. The outdoors world marks an escape from constriction. It is the setting of the proposal's success. It's a mark of the importance of Charlotte and Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice that Jane Austen includes them in the pattern of inside and outside. She does not do this with Jane and Mr. Bingley. We know that their proposal takes place indoors, but the scene is only reported after the event. The absence of a marked place diminishes the importance of the couple. The presence of Mr. Collins and Charlotte in the lane magnifies their role. By the time of Year 12 classes on Emma, we were a long way from the bias of hidden meanings. The seniors came to love Jane Austen. What grew even more strongly was their sense of admiration, their sense of awe. Point 7. We're nearly there. You're doing well, ladies and gentlemen. You're all paying attention. I almost have an ending. So far, I have mentioned Persuasion only in passing. It merits some attention. Persuasion was the first text of Austen I taught in 1975. It was my second year in the classroom. Askim's new head of English of that year trusted me with a sixth form class. They'd be 66 years old today. I can still see their 18-year-old faces. Persuasion was also my own first undergraduate text in English 1. Persuasion went well. The class was engaged by the renewal of the bond between Anne and Captain Wentworth. They were particularly responsive to the sense of conflicting duties. Duty to a parent set against duty to oneself. I was looking forward to the lesson which marked the novel's resolution. Anne and Captain Wentworth are now engaged again, after an outdoor scene and a walk. Austen gives Anne this memorable address to Captain Wentworth when they're back at the house. Their re-engagement is not yet public knowledge. Meetings between them are necessarily brief. Anne is describing her duty to Lady Russell, her godmother, whose advice 8 years earlier led to Anne's breaking her engagement to Captain Wentworth. It was in one of these short meetings, each apparently occupied in admiring a fine display of greenhouse plants, that she said, "I have been thinking over the past and trying impartially to judge of the right and the wrong. I mean with regard to myself. And I must admit that I was right, much as I suffered from it. That I was perfectly right in being guided by the friend whom you will love better than you do now. To me, she was in the place of a parent. Do not mistake me, however. I'm not saying that she did not err in her advice. It was perhaps one of those cases where advice is good or bad only as the event decides, and in my case, I certainly never should, in any circumstance of tolerable similarity, give such advice. But I mean, I was right in submitting to her. And if I had done otherwise, I should have suffered more in continuing the engagement than I did even in giving it up, for I should have suffered in my conscience. I have now, as far as such a sentiment is allowable in human nature, nothing to reproach myself with. And if I mistake not, a strong sense of duty is no bad part of a woman's portion. It is a statement of compromise. Lady Russell's advice may have been questionable, but Anne believed she was right in submitting to her. This address and those concluding words truly moved that class in 1975. Listen again. A strong sense of duty is no bad part of a woman's portion. But look again. Look at where Jane Austen sets the moment. Think of Jane Austen as the director of place. It was in one of these short meetings, each apparently occupied in admiring a fine display of greenhouse plants, that she, Anne Elliot, said, "The scene is within the house. It is also in a greenhouse with a fine display of plants. It is both inside and outside. The one place both of the proposal's prior failure and of its current success. The two opposite places can coexist in a spirit of compromise, just as Anne Elliot can compromise between the poor advice she received and what she saw as her duty to follow it." We left Persuasion then in 1975 with that idea. It was both the expression and the place setting of a woman's spirit of independence, a spirit which lies in an understanding of her sense of duty. Duty is both what Anne believed she must do and where 8 years later she gives voice to that duty. With such a class of young women finishing school in 1975 and understanding the meaning of reconciliation in a place setting, I was content. Point 8, my epilogue. I've learned from my own experience, ladies and gentlemen, and from watching the experience of others, what I call the shock of art. That shock refers to a moment of recognition, which comes as a shock that a work of art, a novel, a poem, a play, a symphony, an opera, a painting, can powerfully illustrate a core of human truth. The shock strikes almost as a physical blow, but the blow is benign. The shock makes us aware of an idea, a perspective, a pattern which we hadn't previously seen. As we sense it, the shock effects a change. I learned this from my mother. Both Mum and Dad were readers. They, like my brother and I, were working class. Their schooling had been gravely truncated by the Great Depression, but they loved books, and they wanted for their two sons the education which history had denied them. A particular phrase, which is not mine, well characterises Mum and Dad. They were ordinary, cultivated readers. Mum would show my brother and me an element of a novel or poem which stood out in her mind. Mum loved the 1950s novel The Nun's Story. She read to us once a small moment in a key scene. Mother Mathilde, the superior, fears that Sister Luke, the novel's protagonist, has fallen in love with the surgeon she works with. Sister Luke reassures her that she has not. Of course I've not fallen in love. I only cherish him, ma mère, deeply, for his skill and selflessness when there's a life to be saved. I think he's always very close to God in those unearthly hours when he operates. Mum liked the distinction between fallen in love and cherish. She explained to us the difference in meaning. 2 lessons for her sons. 1 lesson in vocabulary and 1 lesson in recognizing a profound human truth, the shock of art. I've seen this too in my partner. He's an artist, he paints. Our visits to Paris and to New York over recent years have always included visits to galleries. When he stands in front of a painting by Van Gogh, he shakes slightly. His hands actually tremble. It's the shock of art. My own first shock came from reading Jane Austen. I have always remembered my first reading of Mansfield Park. It was my second year at university. I was 20. There was a congruence of sorts between events of my life of 2 years earlier and the events of the novel. I remember the sense of an epiphany, of a sudden revelation in those 2 remarkable sentences I've already quoted to you. Portsmouth was Portsmouth. Mansfield was home. The shock of art. I've made further discoveries. The tutoring that I do these days down in the eastern suburbs is mainly of the children of the students whom I took years before. The calls come, the emails come, the messages come. Mr. Taaffe, will you please come and save my son's English, my daughter's English? Please come and teach him, come and teach her what you taught us. The meetings which follow carry all manner of reminiscence. The mothers of today were my students from my classes of 30, 40, 45 years ago. They remember the poems, ladies and gentlemen. They certainly remember Shakespeare. And you'll be pleased to know they remember Jane Austen. Austen has grown with them. Many have said to me that through Austen they understand my point about the shock of literature. The most memorable account of the shock came in the form of an apology. Until the apology, I'd forgotten the earlier moment. But back in my lost youth, in a year when we were studying Emma, one sixth former made her view of Austen very clear to me and to the class. Jane Austen is just stupid. The passing years, in the course of her life, had taught her otherwise. It was at the annual luncheon for the Asthma Old Girls. I was invited to be the guest speaker. I'll finish with this lady's words. Mr. Taaffe, I have to apologise to you what I said in sixth form about Jane Austen. How could I have said it? That Jane Austen was stupid. The words tortured her. Each syllable was a dagger into her heart. She'd been carrying the guilt for years. The moment had the dramatic force of an operatic aria. I think we're in The Marriage of Figaro, Act 4, the Paderno aria from The Count. I heard, Mr. Taaffe, I want to tell you that we've moved to the country, to the Southern Highlands. It's for my husband's work. I'm fine with the move, and the country is a better place than the eastern suburbs for the children to grow up. I'm involving myself in village life. And I've opened Emma again. Jane Austen has it right. It is just what life is in a country village. It is exactly right. Mr. Taaffe, please forgive me for what I said. I told her that I was a long way now from the world of absolution, but I did assure her all good. We chatted on amicably. I said to her that I was very pleased she was enjoying what Jane Austen offers all of us. On a first reading, and certainly on rereadings, those wonderful novels make each of us into an ordinary, cultivated reader, like my mother and father. That is the truth, universally acknowledged by us all. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sure there will be some questions. I just wanted to add to your amazing analysis of the visit to Pemberley and the looking out the windows and the points of view. The lovely touch that Jane Austen gives with calling the housekeeper Mrs. Reynolds.
Yes.
The name of the great artist, portrait painter.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. Yes,
and
yes.
so we're getting her portrait of Mr. Darcy as well. And
yes, that's right. Yes.
The way in which you analysed the scenes and made us think about them, and I could tell people were with you every step of the way. It was just simply marvellous.
I used to tell the girls that if they had a relationship which was approaching a marriage proposal and they wanted to pursue things and push it in that direction, all they needed to do was to take a walk around Centennial Park. There's a 4-kilometre circuit, people walk it every day. I walk it, yes. They smiled. They didn't say no, they smiled.
And it's such a human touch. So what girl keen on a guy who's not accidentally been in the right place at the right time? It's so fabulous. Ben, when you're teaching Jane Austen's novels, do you have or did you have a problem with the girls finding some things unfamiliar? A friend of mine was teaching Wuthering Heights, and she said that the girls all thought that Wuthering Heights was a suburb, like Eleanor and they couldn't understand how Heathcliff kept stalling in and out of the suburb. And they didn't get that it was the name of a house, which perhaps an English person would pick up on more quickly. Another reader I spoke to when I was talking to a group of girls about Emma asked me what Mr. Elton's job was. She didn't know what a clergyman was. A minister would be a more familiar term, perhaps, to an Australian girl than clergyman. So, did you?
No, they didn't know. Now, as I said, their reaction was expecting Jane Austen to hide her meaning. They found that she didn't. That the literal world made sense. And when you start with 16, 17, 18-year-olds with ideas about marriage, you're on a very familiar ground. They're aware of their parents' marriage. There is a wonderful moment in Pride and Prejudice, which Jane Austen edited much later after the first writing. The chapter opens that had she looked to her parents' marriage as a model, she would be disappointed, something to that effect. That always rang true, and I can still see the girl in sixth form. We were doing Mansfield Park, and she was in my roll call class, and I did know of the circumstances in her family. And I made the point that for Jane Austen, Fanny's father, her true parent, was Sir Thomas, not her actual father from Portsmouth. And I remember saying, Jane Austen knows that just because you're a father doesn't necessarily mean that you are a parent. And this girl said aloud, "That's certainly true." And I thought, that's the shock of art. That's the shock, the recognition. Yeah. No, they got it.
So, any questions?
The question is...
So I just wanted to pick up on, your theme of, ordinary cultivated readers, and just expand on what you were saying, Susanna. Are you finding it more difficult to create those ordinary cultivated readers? I mean, I know you teach in a place that's probably affluent. The girls come from a background where reading is, celebrated. But are you finding that more difficult? And then, I guess added to that, are you finding it more difficult for the students to connect with classic literature in particular, and how are they responding to that?
Alas, yes.
Yeah.
I left Ascom. I stopped teaching in 2010, and I had a small part-time job introducing the school to 2016. So this experience is of a previous generation. Yes. I find with the tutoring that I do that students haven't read the books. So when I have to meet a new student, I say, before we start, I want to have a meeting with you and with your mother and father, or talking to the mother and father, with you and your daughter, just to go over the sort of work that I do and what you expect and your daughter expects. And I say to usually a girl, of all those lovely poems that you've read in years 7 to 10, which poem stands out most in your mind? Okay. I'm sure that you've read a collection of poems by a particular author, a little anthology that a teacher would put together, perhaps an Australian poet. Could you tell me the name of the poet who's come up? Okay. And of all the novels, I know you'll tell me the truth, of all the novels that you have studied in years 7 to 10, how many did you actually read for yourself? One mother said to me as she set up the meeting, "My daughter hasn't read anything since year 5, and you don't have to tell me what that means. It means she has a vocabulary of a year 5 student." I said, I'm sorry that you have to know that, but I'm glad that's clear to you. Alas, yes. And when they have to read, they will find a list of characters from Wikipedia and a summary of the plot, and they will go through the scenes that the teacher reads in class. And some of them I think, genuinely believe that's reading the text. You don't actually read a book beginning to end. I do meet some exceptions. And I can think of one, a boy who's now, well, a young man, he's now at Sydney University. And I taught his mother in 9, 10, 11 and 12, and I taught him in 9, 10, 11 and 12 through tutoring. And he thought reading was wonderful. When I first met him, I said to him, well, what are you reading at the moment? He said, have you heard of George Orwell, Ben? Yes. He said, I'm reading Homage to Catalonia. Is there anything else that you'd recommend? I said, yes, I could recommend that. Yes. Now, that was different. Yes, it was different from the norm, but that's what you'd like to hear. You'd like to think that there were a whole lot of students in Year 9 who have suddenly met a writer. In his case, it was George Orwell. It doesn't matter who it is, they've met it. And I know COVID has closed the theatres, but I do ask the question, what's the last play that you've seen live in the theatre? One boy didn't know what that meant. He said, you mean a movie? I said, no, a play. That's when there's a stage and the actors come on and perform the play. Oh, I don't like that. Well, have you seen any? No, I don't like that. I don't like that. What are you doing at school? Well, you have to do a critical study of Hamlet. So we're sitting down to do a critical study of Hamlet, and we don't ever see a play at all, let alone a performance of Shakespeare, and we haven't read anything. I find myself saying to these students, imagine an art student who's doing art and hates it, finds it's a compulsory subject, has not ever been to an art gallery, doesn't know the meaning of the word exhibition, you have to define that for this young man or young woman, and seriously says, I don't know why you have these paintings anyway, you can just take a picture of something that you want. Can you help me with my essay on Picasso? The answer is no, I can't. Who can? There's a lot of that now. It's not, I'm sure it's not universal, and I'm sure too that in tutoring I see the students for whom English is an intractable problem, and in many cases you can't help. But when you meet a student who's interested in the world, who likes to read, who likes vocabulary, you have all the means of taking the student further. And that's a pleasure to do. I had one girl, just at the end of this term, it got to the minute at the end of the hour that I was there to tutor her, and she looked at the clock and the hour was up and she closed the book and I was still speaking. You didn't do that in the Aston classrooms, Mr. Taylor. If you did, the penalty was terrible. But she did that and I thought, oh, I'm just here for the hour, so you'll tolerate me.
As a teacher, so...
Other questions?
Yes, please.
Any other questions anyone would like to ask?
Just a comment. I'll give you, my grade is 99 out of 100 versus today's talk. You would have got 100 if you had included Captain Wentworth's letter to Anne.
Thank you.
That is my soul.
Point taken. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to ask Malvina to come and thank Ben for his wonderful presentation.
Well, what a fabulous talk. Thank you so much, Ben, and lucky Ascombe schools, don't you think? I had lucky Manly Girls High, where I had some beautiful teachers who introduced me to my first Austen, which was Mansfield Park. My older sister's first Austen was Pride and Prejudice, and she said, "This is stupid." And I was electrified, so I thought, well, the treasure's ahead. And so often school is the first Austen that we read, or high school, university, as you say, or maybe when we come to a Jane Austen meeting, you never know. But in the end, we all enjoy living and loving Austen. And we really, really appreciate your fabulous talk this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.